everyone, in this video we are going to cover the second of the series of the self and the other. Self has a natural draw towards the other. We know this because any single self is actually a part of the other. Based on the self's desire to fit into the other, the self tries to inflict its will on the other. Because the other, in its accumulation of parts, is more powerful than the self, it is so because it is more complex and more movement is done, thereby it doing more work than the self. Because the other does more work than the self, the other has more suffering than the self. The other has more suffering because all the other selves are trying to inflict their will on the other all at the same time. So because the self is drawn into the other, the self starts to suffer. This reverses the distinction between the self and the other to the self, because as the suffering is inflicted on the self starts to do more work. The self then gets more complicated doing more work. The self getting more complicated means the self has to divide itself into parts that make the self plural. The self then necessarily has to do more work to try and inflict more and more of its will on the other. To the self, the other begins to look to have less suffering, do less action, look less complex, and look less numerous. But no matter how hard the self tries, it cannot contend with the will of the other. This creates a perpetual problem of suffering for the self and the other unless something comes to intervene. So it is in the self wanting to be a part of the other that it wants to inflict its will on the other. Because the other inflicts its will on the self more than the other, this creates a perpetual cycle of suffering that is inflicted on the self, which in turn inflicts suffering on the other. Unless there is something to intervene, the other will end up destroying itself. Since the other is simply individual selves, the other will collapse. But the self did not come about by itself, so there must be a greater self that the self comes from. This greater self, by way of creating the self, has also created the other. The greater self cannot be great if the other destroys the individual selves, so the greater self has to intervene. We will pick up here next time. Thanks for watching. Talk to you later. Bye.